Okay, so good afternoon everybody, and welcome to this very special webinar this afternoon, hosted by the Geographical Association and delivered to you by Discover the World Education. My name is Karen. I'm one of the area managers at Discover the World Education, as well as being their geography consultant and one of the Icelandic teacher tour leaders. I was previously a head of department and pastoral deputy for over 20 years and worked in a variety of different schools, teaching over 20,000 students. I now have the opportunity to arrange amazing trips for students and often get to lead them, which means that I still have the opportunity to teach, and now I get to probably teach in the best classroom in the world. I also deliver CPD to schools across the UK, offering teachers a variety of workshops in order to develop their classroom skills. So I'm very, very lucky that I still have the opportunity to work in education and get to do fantastic things, particularly in Iceland. So what we've come to look at today is a little volcano that was very unheard of and unpronounceable, actually. And if you just bear with me just for a second, as my PowerPoint is not moving. So just hold on just a second, please. Okay, we seem to have it moving now, which is fantastic. So 10 years ago, a small, unheard of, unpronounceable volcano erupted in the south of Iceland. There have been many eruptions in Iceland prior to this, and actually since then, and you won't have heard too much about those, but this one was slightly different. It was different because it affected and captured the interest of the whole of the rest of the world, but particularly in America and Europe. What we're going to look at today is we're going to reflect on this eruption. I'm going to encourage the teachers who are joining us to get their students to think like geographers and go beyond that and think like geographical scholars. And for those students that are joining us, I want you to think about the different perspectives, the different geographical perspectives that we can take this particular case study, at this particular eruption, and look at the different ways that it affected the world, it affected Iceland, and actually made us all think about different things for the future. We're going to look at the specifics of the eruption, what has changed since the eruption, and also what the future holds, sort of like following this particular eruption, and not just 10 years on, but for another 10 years on as well. I'm also going to introduce you to some free resources, which you will be able to find on the Discover the World Education website. These are usually for teachers, but obviously as a student, if you want to take a look at these, they may enhance and enrich your learning, certainly give you some more information about volcanoes. And I think particularly with the virtual teaching that's going on at the moment, a lot of online teaching that's going on at the moment, this should really get to help you. So let's set the scene. Now, at the Geographical Association conference last week, I was very interested to listen to one of the teachers there who said that she was taking her case study information slightly differently. And rather than teaching the case study, she has started to introduce more information about the actual country in order to give a better depth of understanding for that particular case study. And she started doing this a couple of years ago, and she really felt that this prepared her Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 pupils more for Key Stage 5, and they got better results because their depth of knowledge was greater, but also it really helps those Key Stage 5 students into their university studies. So it's good to get a perspective of the whole country. So I'm going to give you some information a little bit about Iceland, particularly in terms of the social, the physical, the environmental, and the economical side of Iceland. And this should enhance your understanding of the actual volcano, the impacts, the primary impacts, the secondary impacts, and also looking at preparation and planning for the future. So as you can see from this particular map, this particular slide, we're looking here at population density. The population density in Iceland is very sparse. Okay, as you can see, a lot of the area is green. That means it has hardly anybody living in it at all. The white areas on this map are depicting the ice masses, the ice caps, and we'll look at that in a minute. But you can see that 78% of Iceland's population live within that red circle. And Iceland has a population of around about 350,000, so a very small population in any case. This slide shows you where the glaciers and the ice caps are. It's really important when we're looking at volcanic eruptions in Iceland to link this, so thinking like a geographer, to link this to where our ice caps are, because this is what makes volcanic eruptions in Iceland quite unique. And you can see here the largest ice mass in Europe, Eyjafjallajökull, in the southeast of the corner there. And then we have Eyjafjallajökull, which is the smallest ice cap in Iceland, but quite possibly the most significant. And we'll look at that in just a moment. You can see from this particular information that Iceland, lots of volcanoes, and this is the tectonic setting of Iceland. You can see here that it has 33 active volcanoes, so it's quite a lot for such a small country, and 30 of those active volcanoes sit under the ice, and that is what makes it very, very unique and very different, and why Iceland can actually be looked at as a very sort of bespoke case study in terms of sort of, you know, your explanation and your understanding of this particular theme and topic. Now, it's this combination of ice and volcanic activity that does make it very distinctive. There are a high magnitude of glacial floods because when the volcano erupts, it causes very dramatic and quick sort of like melting of the actual glacier, and this is causing the glacial floods. So it's not just the lava, it's not just the ash, it's not just the disruption or anything like that. It really is this combination because of the unique tectonic setting. And if we think beyond this, there are some sort of thoughts, and there will be evidence to show that actually climate change could start to impact the volcanic activity in Iceland. And we will look at this sort of like later on, because there is some thinking that as the glacial areas start to melt, this releases pressure on the volcanoes, which could mean that there are more volcanic eruptions in the future. There's some extended reading that you might like to do on this, both teachers and students actually. A lady, a scientist called Fiona Tweed, she actually wrote an article for the GA in the autumn edition of their magazine, and it is all about the Icelandic volcanoes. It's about their uniqueness, so the linking between the ice caps and the volcanoes, so this particular sort of like distinctive tectonic setting. And you might want to take a look at that because it makes some very sort of like interesting reading. And I think for students, if you are doing A-level or if you are looking at that higher level GCSE or looking to maybe study hazards in the future, this is going to be that thing that sets you different from everybody else. This is your X factor. When you're talking about those high level grades that you're really looking for, having some extended reading by a scientist like Fiona will actually set you apart from other students. So that gives you the actual sort of like background to this volcano. So let's look at Eyjafjallajökull in its sort of like just at the volcano itself. The volcano was relatively unheard of. It had remained dormant since 1823. So it really isn't a very, very active volcano. it was pretty insignificant. It wasn't a volcano that the Icelandic people talked about. It certainly wasn't heard of sort of like across the rest of Europe. And it really became sort of like this highlighted place just overnight, really. It woke up, and it woke up around about 10 years ago, near enough to the day. It had two eruptions. The first one was on the 20th of March, and this was a fissure eruption. So it was along a line, and some of you may have seen the Top Gear team decided to go and take a look at the fissure eruption. And it became a little bit of a tourist attraction because you could go and see it, you could go and see the lava, you could get quite close to it. And many people did actually go and see this particular fissure eruption. But then on the 14th of April, the eruption really did start to sort of like intensify as a major event. And around about 200 meters of glacier melted in just a very, very short period of time. And we had this huge plume of volcanic ash that rose between 8 and 14 kilometers up into the sky. The ash itself was incredibly unique because it was very, very light and fine, quite glass-like. And this went very, very high up into the atmosphere. And if you compare that to the density of the ash that came out of the Katla eruption in 1918, they're very, very different. And I would encourage you, if you do get the opportunity when you go to Iceland, is try and go to the Eyjafjallajökull glacier. This is one of the glaciers that sits just to the east of Eyjafjallajökull, and actually you can see there not just the ash from the Eyjafjallajökull eruption of 2010, but also the ash of the 1918 Katla eruption. And you can do some really, really good comparisons between the two. So this eruption, 14th of April 2010, and I know that there are many people that are probably listening that actually remember this eruption quite well. I was very, very fortunate to be in Iceland in the July of 2010, and I was able to see quite firsthand those amazing impacts, the effects of this particular volcanic hazard, and particularly in terms of the loss of glacier outlets, of sort of floodplains, of bridges, that sort of stuff, where the actual floods did take place. So it was quite dramatic, the change there. So we had the heat from the eruption melting the ice very, very quickly. We also had weather conditions, which basically meant that the northwesterly winds brought the ash across Europe. And this was the impact across Europe that really threw this particular volcano into the limelight. Not just that, because obviously Europe is a big hub for flying to America, a lot of American flights were also cancelled. And you can actually sort of like see that this volcano was starting to have this worldwide impact. Many people really, really sort of like struggled with getting home and being stranded, rather like we've experienced over the last sort of like 6 weeks, where rescue flights and sort of, you know, different people were sort of taken to different areas to try and get them home. Okay, so this unfolding chaos took this very unheard of volcano that everybody was trying to pronounce, which actually is quite funny. If you look at the YouTube clips that I've put on the slide, some of these are actually quite funny as people are trying to pronounce this particular volcano. And it threw this little volcano worldwide, and all of a sudden everybody knew about this little volcano. Okay, so that gives you some background, it gives you some prior knowledge, some depth of understanding, so that we can actually start now to look at this relatively small eruption, but look at how it had quite a significant local and global scale. Now, I've chosen to focus on 5 specific areas, so 5 geographical perspectives. Some of them are social, some of them are environmental, Some of them look at the economy, and some of them are obviously physical as well. So we're going to look at all those different geographical perspectives. And the 5 that we've chosen to focus on today are the aviation industry and international trade, the Icelandic economy, the farming communities, the health of the local people, and then, which really links into your GCSE and A-level studies, the monitoring and preparation for future events. So first of all, international trade. Okay, we live in a very globalized world, and international trade for everybody has become incredibly important. What people sometimes don't understand is this butterfly effect. So therefore, European airspace had stopped. Okay, planes stopped flying for between 5 and 10 days. We'll look at aviation in just a minute. But the impact of the closure of European airspace basically meant that this had impacts all around the world. I've taken one little one here, and I'm sure that when you go away, and I hope that you will research more about the Eyjafjallajökull eruption, but this one that I was particularly interested in was the impact felt by Kenya, and in particular the Kenyan horticultural industry, who lost on average $3 million a day because they were growing fresh flowers for the UK market, but because they couldn't fly across European airspace, those fresh flowers were left to rot, and they actually lost huge amounts of money just in that short period of time. And it just shows you that because we are reliant on the aviation industry to transport many of our fresh produce around the world, that even a very small event like this one, which was in comparison to other volcanoes, a very, very small event, can actually have a huge impact on other countries. Let's look at aviation. Aviation, it really was a massive thing, because the CAA, which is the Civil Aviation Authorities, they were actually criticised for closing airspace, and they were criticised for keeping airspace closed for too long. People didn't understand why aeroplanes couldn't fly around or through or sort of like between the ash cloud. And because of that, there were many flights actually cancelled. Over 100,000 flights were cancelled and 10 million passengers were affected. So it did have huge impacts all around the world. At the time, in 2010, there was zero tolerance on flying through ash-affected skies. And this therefore meant that because of the impact, subsequently, volcanologists, engineers, modelers, they've had to learn more about how ash affects aviation. So they've looked at 3 main areas. They've looked at engine design, so looking at the coating for the engines. They're starting more to look at ash concentrations to see how sort of like concentrated the ash has to be in the atmosphere in order for planes to fly safely through it. And then also looking at developing more accurate meteorological forecasting to see if they can predict where the ash is going to go and then maybe divert the flight paths around it. Now, technology is obviously 10 years on. And this is a really developing sort of area. And they have really sort of like looked at this because they understand that the world, because of the way we are very much reliant on the aviation industry. They have started to make really good progress in this. You can see this table gives an indication for airlines as to when it is considered safe to actually fly through an ash cloud. Okay, so they have moderated that zero tolerance ash policy. It's allowed aviation airlines and the people who make those decisions, I'll show you that in just a minute, to make the decision as to whether or not it is deemed safe to fly through those ash concentrations. And this table that we're showing here now, that actually gives them sort of guidance as to when they can and when they can't fly through the ash cloud, okay? The CAA, they are actually ultimately responsible for this. And this is a UK policy that has been put into place, but it really has been spread particularly across Europe, but also other countries. They've got their own levels, and they are very, very similar. It's kind of considered to be a global agreed policy, this particular one. In addition to that, they actually tested this policy in the 2011 Grímsvötn eruption. This was a volcano you probably haven't heard of unless you've been to Iceland, but it's certainly an eruption that you wouldn't have heard of because it didn't make the news, really. It ejected 3 times more ash than Eyjafjallajökull. Okay, and the ash reached a height of 20 kilometers up into the sky. So technically it was a slightly bigger eruption than Eyjafjallajökull, but we didn't hear too much about it. There were some differences. The ash was slightly coarser, it fell to the ground more quickly, so it didn't stay up in the atmosphere too long. And also the weather conditions actually dispersed the ash more quickly. But because it didn't have the huge aviation impact that the Eyjafjallajökull eruption had, we didn't really hear about it. And planes were able to fly. So using the table that we saw on the previous slide, and using the volcanic action sort of like points that I'm going to point out in a minute, they were able to fly, and only 900 of the 90,000 flights that were due to happen during this particular eruption were disrupted. So it just shows you that just a year later, the impact was far, far less. These are the volcanic ash advisory centres. So these are something that have been set up since the 2010 eruption. And what they have done is they have actually split the world into 9 sectors. And those particular sectors are responsible for the ash and the volcanic eruptions that actually happen within those areas. So it basically carries out some very, very vital monitoring. This helps track the volcanic eruptions, and particularly in terms of the ash, which could fall into the air traffic superhighways. You're probably aware that we do have some sort of like very busy flight paths around the world, and aeroplanes tend to follow the same flight path. And it's those flight paths that we try and protect from these ash clouds, these ash eruptions. This particular map here, I love this map. It shows technology at its best. And from here you can see the aviation superhighways. You can see where the paths of the planes go. You can see the red areas that I've circled here. They are the frequent ash producing eruptions. You'll notice there's a very strong link here. The Ring of Fire. This is where the majority of frequent ash producing eruptions happen. But you'll see, particularly along the mid-Atlantic ridge there, that we do have volcanoes there that are also occasional ash producing eruptions. And you can then see where the superhighways are. And you can see the one going from Europe to America is a massive aviation superhighway. And of course, this is where Eyjafjallajökull is. So this is quite a big sort of like area, and it's London that actually monitors this particular aviation superhighway, this particular volcanic area. So there's a monitoring system in London where they look at all the evidence and judge whether or not it is deemed fit to fly in those particular times. Okay, so moving on from aviation now, and we are going to look at the Icelandic economy. There was a dramatic crash in the economy in 2008 in Iceland. 3 major banks in Iceland defaulted on their debts, and they basically collapsed, and it caused the value of the Icelandic krona to absolutely plunge to its lowest level in decades. And unemployment tripled to 4%. Now, 4% doesn't seem very high, but Iceland, as Icelandic people, as you know, they're a very, very small population. So therefore, their unemployment levels are very, very low. And actually, they have had a big drive in the last sort of 4 or 5 years to actually encourage immigration, because they have more jobs than they have working people. So actually, to have an unemployment level of 4%, it's actually a very, very high amount. The collapse of the Icelandic krona did make it slightly better for foreigners and for tourists to actually come to Iceland. And it did start to have a little bit of an impact on bringing back the economy and helping with the recovery. But not really. It was a little bit unstable because obviously people, still found Iceland quite expensive. Many people, didn't have any jobs. They were having to work 3 jobs to make ends meet. The taxes were incredibly high. So 2008, 2009, 2010 were very, very difficult years for the Icelandic people and for Iceland's economy. And then an eruption happened, 2010. And this really put Iceland firmly on the map, because there were news articles every day. Every time you turned on the telly, you would actually see news articles about Iceland, about this volcano, showing them beautiful pictures of Iceland, their little quirky turf-roofed houses, their little wooden buildings, fantastic landscapes. And all of a sudden, not just because of the volcanic eruption, which actually people are excited about, but all of a sudden people were starting to see this country and think, oh, that looks quite a nice place to see. It did start off as kind of volcano tourism. People wanted to go and see the volcano. They wanted some of the ash. But apart from that, it just put the name in their imagination. It put the name, that's somewhere we haven't been, that's somewhere we would like to go to. You can see here, there's a graph here, tourist numbers from sort of like 2008, which is when I was saying about the banks collapse and the krona starting to make things slightly cheaper for people to visit Iceland. You can see here the tourist numbers, they stayed pretty similar. They went up a little bit in 2008, but then they plateaued. But look at the graph from 2010. There was a dramatic increase of foreign passengers between 2010 and 2018. And it really, really started to become a massive impact on their economy. In 2018, over 2 million people visited Iceland just in that 1 year. So that just shows you the impact from 2010 to 2018, how this little volcano can actually generate masses of tourism. Okay. Globalization. As we know, airlines are now flying all around the world. When I first started going to Iceland in 1996, there was only one airline going to Iceland. It was Iceland Air, the national airline. It's the airline that most of us still use now to actually travel to Iceland. But obviously, as the demand to get to a country actually starts to increase, more airlines are starting to fly there. So therefore, we do have some low-cost airlines who fly there now. So EasyJet, they fly there. And this meant that actually more and more people could start going to Iceland, which again impacted on their tourism, impacted on their economy. In addition to that, the tourist board in Iceland, they really used the eruption of 2010 to springboard an advertising campaign. As you can see from this quote, Iceland has never been more awake, and there has never been a more exciting time to visit the country. And this was a social media marketing campaign in 2011, which basically used the 2010 eruption to actually relighten everybody's interest, spark an interest in this particular country. Their focus was to allow people to share their pictures, share their stories, share their memories of a positive event in Iceland. So maybe swimming in a lagoon, maybe climbing the most amazing mountain, maybe going on a glacier, maybe going on the black beaches, looking at puffins, maybe seeing the northern lights. So turning those positive events or those positive feelings that they have had in Iceland and actually changing what was a negative natural event. Okay, so it really was quite a big thing. And for those of you who are students and for you teachers who are listening, this is something that really can be used for students to develop their critical thinking. Was it the eruption in 2010 that started to boost Iceland's economy, particularly in terms of tourism, or was it because of a social media marketing campaign? Because obviously social media also started to develop at this time. Was it that, or was it the eruption? And this is something that really students can start to really think about, start to make a decision, look at both sides of the story. I can't give you an answer. I don't know. They just seem to happen at the same time, but it does seem that it didn't come into sort of fruition into the line of thinking until the 2010 eruption. Okay, you have probably heard of a series called Game of Thrones, and after the 2010 eruption, HBO actually saw a lot of the landscapes from looking at the TV programs and the films and the footage of the volcano, and they actually started to use the setting of Iceland for Game of Thrones. So therefore, I think something about like 60% of the Game of Thrones is actually filmed in Iceland. You can see the picture here. This is Arrowhead Mountain, which is up in Snæfellsnes. And many people now do want to come and visit these particular locations because they've seen them on the telly. And then we have the Bieber effect as well. So Justin Bieber, he decided to actually film many of his videos on his I'll Show You song that he recorded, and he's had over 455 million views on YouTube. And he really looked at different areas, spent a lot of time actually in Iceland choosing the location as to how to film it. So it's had a huge impact on people wanting to come and see where these particular places have been filmed. In addition to that, the country since 2010 has been used as the James Bond setting, Fast and Furious, Passengers, all of those different things, and they've all happened since 2010. You can see here some of the social media campaigns. Iceland was among the most Googled holiday destinations in America. That particular headline came from. It was the third most searched term on Pinterest in the US in 2015. So it really has had a huge social media impact, and this has really helped to boost their economic recovery, to boost their tourism numbers. And again, I would ask you to really encourage the critical thinking here, because I've done a lot of research on what was the catalyst to this sort of like tourism boom, to this economic recovery. And I can tell you that we actually have come to the conclusion that the 2010 did generate all of this interest. Now, before I go on to show you some figures about tourism and everything, I just want to focus a little bit on tourist numbers. because since 2018, there has been quite a steady decrease in tourism numbers. So although there was a rapid rise between 2010 and 2017, evidence is now showing us that it actually plateaued in 2017. And then since 2018, those numbers have started to steadily decrease, which gives me evidence, and possibly I want you to really think about the critical thinking behind this, that it was the 2010 eruption that sparked this interest. It kept the interest for 7 years and is now starting to decrease just slightly. And I want to give you some perspective. To an Icelander, a group of more than 2 is a crowd. You remember I said to you that their population is very, very low. You know, I remember one of the first times going to Iceland, and my driver, when I was guiding, and my driver apologized for the traffic jam in Reykjavik. There was 3 cars in front of me. And I thought, for somebody who lives in sort of like, you know, suburban Surrey, you know, 3 cars really isn't a traffic jam. So, you know, they may say, oh, it's really, really busy. Yeah, there's more than 2 or 3 people there. Yes, there is. But for us, it really isn't that busy. The Lake District gets 7 times more visitors than the whole of Iceland, yet we still go to the Lake District. It's incredibly beautiful and incredibly remote. And the difference between Iceland and the Lake District in sort of like 2010, 2015 was the fact that the Lake District's infrastructure was in place. So therefore they could cope with 7 times more visitors than Iceland could, because you didn't really notice, apart from those real honeypot areas, you didn't really notice that it was particularly busy. The infrastructure in Iceland has very much now caught up. So therefore, although their numbers are still quite reasonably high, you don't really notice them quite so much now. And I have really, I mean, I go to Iceland between 10 and 15 times a year, and I've really started to see the impacts of this better infrastructure, and seeing sort of like the tourist areas not as they were in previous years. It's all about timing, and this is quite key. You know, if you go in the 2nd week of the school holidays in July, it is likely to be busier than if you were to go at the beginning of June or October or April or February. You know, so it is really all about the timing. It's a good picture there about timing, I feel. And walking a few extra steps. You know, don't park the car in certain car parks, and you know, go for a walk. And you know, there's a fantastic waterfall called Skogafoss, and it is absolutely stunning. But Skogafoss is one of 32 cascades in that particular waterfall system, and just walking to the next cascade will give you away, and being a part of the solution, not the problem. So I can tell you that although tourist numbers were increasing, it's now steadily decreasing. So bringing back to the Eyjafjallajökull eruption, you know, it really did have an impact, and maybe not quite so much now. And this is the research that I was telling you about. So we looked at the confluence of factors which triggered this surge. And as you can see, that although those different areas, you know, different themes are covered in this slide here, the key one, the number one trigger to this economic change was the Eyjafjallajökull volcanic eruption. And it really did springboard this economic recovery for Iceland. Okay, just a few more slides giving you some idea of how tourism has grown, how the economic recovery has grown. You can see there aluminium, seafood, tourism, they're all sort of like big parts of the Icelandic economy. And again, as we said, you know, this eruption, it really did start to change the economy. Let's look now at the farming community. So the Eyjafjallajökull had massive consequences on the farming community. The ash fall was a big problem. And because it happened in April, it was at the beginning of spring, it was the lambing period, and therefore their sheep had to actually be housed during the lambing period, which caused a whole problem because the numbers of sheep didn't multiply like they would do normally. So this was a big issue, and many thousands of sheep were actually lost during the ash fall that followed this particular eruption. In addition to that, they were really worried about the long-term effects because they had grown the grass ready for the winter feed, but this grass had to be cut higher so that they didn't pick up the ash from the soil and put it within the grass and within the hay. And they were worried that it was going to lead to shortages of food in the winter. And actually, it did have an impact on that. So therefore, they had to go back to the government, and the government had to support them with the shortages of food in the winter. So for the local farming community, which is a big part of the Icelandic economy and actually the Icelandic culture, this had quite a major impact. There are more sheep in Iceland than there are people. And sheep farming is a big part of their history and a part of their heritage. And you know, this did have a huge impact. The Emergency Relief Fund, it did compensate farmers. It compensated farmers for the loss of their land, the damage to their land, and actually what they needed to do to the recovery of their land because of not just the flooding, but also the amount of ash that was actually on the land. We always talk about in school how the ash actually does sort of add fertilization to the soil. So therefore, the arable farmers actually, after a few years, did benefit from this ashfall. But the pastoral farmers, those sheep farmers, actually did really struggle. So therefore, the Emergency Relief Fund did actually help to compensate those farmers so that they could sort of make good their land and make it better for the future. Unfortunately, the farmers weren't included in the prior emergency planning. And this is something that the farming community, and for those people who are reliant on the farming in Iceland, have actually still been asking for more information on how they can prepare for the next eruption, the next big ash cloud, and actually to try and mitigate the effects of those ash, because it really does affect their livelihood. So that is still something that is work in progress, unfortunately. So even though 10 years on, they're still really looking for a better way to move forward with the ash and with how to protect their livelihoods. Okay, let's look at the health. Now, I know over the last 6 weeks, every time we turn on the telly, that's all we hear about now is the health implications of the world. And the health implications of this particular ash cloud were mainly linked to breathing difficulties. So which seems a bit sort of like ironic in the current circumstances, doesn't it? But obviously for local people and for people living in the south of Iceland, they did have breathing difficulties because of ash inhalation. And this actually was worse for those people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, which is a bit like a lung weakness, really, a breathing weakness, a respiratory weakness. And it also caused quite a lot of irritation to the eyes and the skin. And this next point, I think, is really quite significant at the moment, that they actually gave a lot of the people in the area masks. And these masks covered their eyes and their mouths and their nose. So they were a bit like the ones that we see on the telly at the moment. So the clear masks that go over the eyes and the nose, and then the breathing masks as well. But these particular masks were actually bought in preparation for swine flu. so prior to the 2010 eruption. So they weren't really suitable for people who were working as farmers or outside in the ash trying to rescue livestock and trying to work with livestock. What's really, really important here, and I think this is where we can use our geographical skills and expertise, is that in the current situation, Iceland are actually very, very well prepared for COVID-19. So they had a lot of these masks and a lot of the masks that they had ready for ash eruptions to protect the people from that have actually been used in the current situation of obviously protecting those key workers and people in, protecting themselves from this current virus. So they have really thought about the health implications of the nation. They do have a variety of different masks now, and they really have tried to lessen the impact on outdoor workers, because they do understand that farming is such a big thing. Residents did report quite a lot of respiratory problems and sore eyes, but very, very fortunately, there are no major long-term impacts to health if you are affected by those particular ash clouds, which is great to hear. So in terms of the future, the Meteorological Office in Iceland monitors the volcanoes in Iceland. And if you want to, you can do some extended work and research on this. I've put the website there for you. It's an Icelandic website. And this actually shows all the earthquakes and volcanoes and magmatic tectonic movement that is happening in Iceland all the time. They have a very, very sophisticated network of instruments. This looks at GPS, it looks at satellites, seismic stations, it looks at the height of rivers, it looks at the temperature of the water, it looks at the gas monitoring on loads and loads of different sites all around Iceland. And this is one of the most forward-thinking monitoring systems in the world. So please, please do look at that particular website. It's really, really interesting, and you can sign up to it as well. And actually that will then give you alerts as to when things are happening, or, when sort of like things might happen. There have been times when I've been in Iceland and I've actually received a text to say that there has been an enhanced sort of like temperature on a particular river system, and to just therefore be aware that there could possibly be a chance of an eruption over the coming days, weeks, months. Okay, what we are looking at here is a model which assumes what happens with people once they know about something, and then actually what does particularly happen. And this was a paper that was written prior to the Eyjafjallajökull eruption, and it looked at really what should be the outcome. And this has happened in previous eruptions. With the Eyjafjallajökull eruption, though, they did feel that it was less common that people had a sense of community, and it was a little bit of a lacking in that. They weren't quite so sort of like neighbourhoodly as they had been before. And one of the reasons why they felt that this was the case was because they felt that because technology is more accessible, because there is more knowledge, because of the social nature of people are texting each other and Googling and all of that sort of stuff. There were other factors that were just influencing this trust that actually, we give you the information, this is what's going to happen, and then this is sort of like what we're going to do in the future. And that seemed to be missing a little bit. Icelandic people are quite conformist. They tend to follow what they are told, and what the real sense of community. They really look after each other and that sort of stuff. And this has been really seen in the COVID-19 reaction. They have very, very strictly followed the restrictions, and this kind of is generally what happens with a volcanic eruption. But with the Eyjafjallajökull eruption, it was lacking a little bit. So there are some quite ongoing concerns about the vulnerability of people and about how they are going to respond in the future when the next eruption happens. Just talking about the response in Iceland, should there be a seismic or a volcanic or tectonic event, they have the most fantastic system where they pick up the signal from people's mobile phones. And if they feel that there is going to be a tectonic event or a seismic event, they will text people and give them sort of like information, instructions. And this is fantastic. All the guides and most of the people in Iceland actually have apps which also link them to this system. And this was really shown in the recent seismic event on the Reykjanes Peninsula, where a volcanic system that hadn't been active for hundreds of years showed a slight change, and the ground in that particular volcanic system had started to increase in height. So therefore they had all a text, the people in the local vicinity received a text, and they went for a town meeting and they were given all the evacuation plans, all the instructions. This is what's going to happen, this is where you need to go. And it really has worked and has been very, very effective. Okay, so Futurevolc is a very, very important development since the Eyjafjallajökull eruption, and this is something that Europe has put together using sort of like lots of different information from different meteorological and geological agencies all around Europe and particularly Iceland. And there was huge investment by the EU into this particular system. And this has meant that Iceland and Europe are in a much stronger position to look at when these eruptions are going to happen, hopefully. So there's a lot more monitoring going on, and also how to respond. You probably know Iceland isn't part of the EU, but because many of the countries within the EU were impacted by the Eyjafjallajökull eruption, this is something that they really consider to be important and actually to help lessen the impact of when the next volcanic eruption happens. Again, I've put the website down there for you so you can do some extra reading and looking into this particular monitoring system. It's really, really important. So let's go back to the principle about climate change and whether or not we think that there are going to be more or less volcanic eruptions. Recent trends have shown that actually there are fewer volcanic eruptions, less volcanic activity over the years in Iceland. But we don't really know. We haven't got enough data yet to actually show good comparisons of that. This sort of like decline and monitoring and making predictions as to what can possibly, could be going on there and possibly happen there is actually complicated because of the ice. Obviously, over the last few years, climate change has caused changes in the ice caps and the ice masses in Iceland. Iceland actually lost a glacier last year because of climate change, and there is a lot of evidence, scientific evidence, to say that actually, if it continues the way it is in terms of this steady increase in temperature, that we will actually lose all of Iceland's glaciers in the next 200 years. What we don't know is what the impact of that will be on the volcanoes in Iceland. As we said right at the beginning of this presentation, and Eyjafjallajökull is one of these volcanoes. 30 of Iceland's active volcanoes sit under the ice. So if you remove that ice, there is a potential sort of like possibility that this could trigger an eruption. And I think this is something that we need to pay quite close attention to over the next few years. Okay, so to sum up this particular Eyjafjallajökull case study really, and critical thinking, extended thinking on this. It is a useful trial for bigger eruptions. We are expecting a very large volcano called Katla, which sits within the same volcanic system as Eyjafjallajökull, to erupt. And some of the impacts, some of the lessons that we learned from Eyjafjallajökull are going to be useful for when Katla, notice I didn't say if, but for when Katla is going to erupt. So some of those responses, some of the plans, the Futurevolcano, the monitoring systems, the way that people respond, the volcanic ash advisory centres, those aviation superhighways, the different sort of like modelling, looking at aeroplanes and how they've adapted that, as well as looking at the people, will really help us to sort of like hopefully lessen the impact on people in future and on the environment, obviously. Looking at the economy, at the moment, obviously there is no tourism in Iceland at all. But obviously, you know, looking at that, how is another volcano going to impact on Iceland's economy? Could it mean that nobody wants to visit Iceland because of a volcanic eruption, or could it mean that in the future tourist numbers are going to rise again? And 10 years on, I think both Iceland and the rest of Europe are in a much more resilient position to manage future eruptive events. And this was really triggered by the Eyjafjallajökull eruption. Because of the worldwide impact on this, it maybe sort of like triggered people to sit up and say, you know what, we need to do something. We need to be more resilient. We need to monitor this. We need to prepare people. Okay, so I just really want to sort of like finish this presentation by just showing you some of the resources that we have available on the Discover the World education website. There is a fantastic case study by one of our colleagues, Simon Ross. He has actually put together a 15-minute study video, and this looks at the causes and the impacts of the actual eruption, so not looking at 10 years on. But looking at the actual eruption. And there are some additional teaching resources which you could use to link to that particular video. These are some of the worksheets. There is an extended worksheet on there. I'm not a big lover of worksheets, but actually in the current situation that we're in, I think they do have a little bit of a place to sort of like help you to get through some of the case study information that you need, but also to look at the Katla eruption. So this is an enrichment and extended exercise that you could particularly use as a sort of an independent study here on the Katla eruption. In addition to that, we have some assessment maps, which hopefully you'll be able to use when you get back into the classroom. And these really do trigger the students in terms of knowing sort of about some of the key things to do with the eruption. And then because we are really encouraging students to look at using keywords within their sort of like their literacy, and also in their sort of like their talking in classroom, we do have some good speak like a volcanologist activities there. I have got a couple of more things to see, but I can see that there are some questions coming through. And one of the questions was, why is the population so fixated in southern Iceland? One of the reasons why that is because settlement, permanent settlement in Iceland actually only started around about 100 years ago. Prior to that, it was very much that you sort of like lived in farms, a little bit of a nomadic way of life. And the southwest of Iceland is the place that is most developed in terms of its infrastructure, in terms of its jobs, in terms of sort of where the links to the rest of the world are. And so that's the reason why that is the case. A lot of Iceland is quite remote and is quite barren. You can't grow crops because it's quite mountainous or it's covered in ice. So therefore, that's the reason why the majority of Iceland, the population of Iceland sits in that southwest corner. Another question here, how do people monitor for tectonic activity? There are seismometers. They also use technology to monitor the levels of sulfur in the gas. They also look at the height of the volcanoes to see whether they are rising or falling. And they also look at the temperature of the water to see whether that is rising or falling. So there's lots of different ways that they can actually monitor for that tectonic activity. Another question, what are the signs of a volcanic eruption before it actually takes place? This is very difficult, very, very difficult, because I personally think that volcanoes could be more dangerous than earthquakes because you generally don't get many signs, but you would get the gases, you may get some magmatic movement, you may get tectonic movement, you know, so there's lots of different things that it could show. The ring of fire is the sort of like the circle around the edge of the Pacific Ocean. It's on the edge of the Pacific plate. The Pacific plate is covered in water, so it is an oceanic plate. It's very, very heavy and is surrounded by continental plates on the outside, which are all moving. So the ring of fire is kind of a ring of volcanoes around the edge of the Pacific plate. And it is quite dangerous because there are lots and lots of volcanoes and they have lots of earthquakes. And it's a definite question in your GCSE exams for those students who are listening to me today. So let's move on with the presentation. Just a couple more slides for you. There are also some resources to do with lava. This is quite a higher level activity for high level GCSE, low level A-level students. You can see there's a PowerPoint which could be used by teachers. There's also some maps, different examples of activities that you could use. And there are also some sort of like worksheets and questions that you could tempt your students with. In addition to that, we're also looking at different volcanoes. So maybe comparing, this is a good Key Stage 3 activity. So looking at the volcanoes in Iceland, looking at the volcanoes in Hawaii and comparing between the two. And then as you remember right at the beginning, I said about the fact that there is quite a lot of evidence to say that students perform better using case studies when they have a real understanding of the country where the case study is set. So therefore, within this comparison exercise, we're also looking at the environment, looking at tourism and other social characteristics to do with the particular country that these volcanoes are located in. And then we have two books for some extended reading. Island on Fire is an amazing book. This talks about the Laki eruption, which turned 18th century Europe dark. It's a really, really good read. And it looks at all the different impacts that this particular volcano had. In addition to that, there's also Ian Hardy's Volcanic Eruption, which is a personal account of the Eyjafjallajökull eruptions of 2010. We're in the process of the moment of doing some fantastic resources based on this particular account. Obviously, these have been had to be put on hold because the majority of our colleagues at the company are actually on furlough at the moment. But that is something that I'm sure you can look forward to when we all go back to school later on in the year. Okay, so I will say that I know we have a lot of people online, so it's not really an opportunity for you to ask lots and lots of questions. But obviously, if you do have questions, please do contact us. I know I've answered some of the questions that you've been putting online this afternoon. Please do stay safe. Thank you very, very much for attending. Please do take a look at our website because we do have lots and lots of information that can help both teachers and students. And I look forward to hopefully seeing and speaking with you in the future. Thank you very much.